I have video of Dick Cheney, former vice president, imploding in an interview about torture. I have 3 clips I'm going to play for you. And Lewis, I know you've taken a look at these clips also. Just a complete and utter implosion, completely disconnected from any of the facts on the ground is Dick Cheney. And again, I know I probably don't need to remind our audience about this, but in my mind, the most damning conclusion from the CIA, the Senate torture report, was that the techniques didn't work. All of these long list of stories, including up to and including the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden that were supposedly happening because of these enhanced interrogation techniques, all of these stated to be complete fabrications in the Senate torture report. And Dick Cheney just doesn't care. Dick Cheney, here is Dick Cheney insisting that the techniques worked.
You'll look at it, and if you look at what the people running the agency said and what Jose Rodriguez said, who ran the program, was a good man. That, as I said the other day, I won't use the word on your show, it may be family, it's a crock. It's not true. And
have you read more of the report?
I've read parts of it. Okay. Not the whole report. Hasn't even been released.
Right.
All you've got is
a 500-page. This is the executive summary.
Is a summary. Go read what the directors of the agency said about the report. They were extremely critical of it, as were the Republicans who served on the committee. It's a flawed report. It didn't begin to approach what's required by way of responsible oversight.
Does it plant any seed of doubt in you, though?
No.
No seed of doubt at all.
Absolutely.
All of this information in here, no seed of doubt that whether this worked or not.
It worked. It absolutely did work.
And of course, Dick Cheney is not even calling these techniques torture. Remember, waterboarding is something that the U.S. considered torture when it was done to American soldiers during World War II. The U.S. went after Japanese soldiers, convicted several Japanese soldiers for what they called the what did they call it? Water cure, which is essentially waterboarding. It's pouring water on someone and making them think that they're going to drown to death. We went after Japanese soldiers. We called it torture. Dick Cheney, though, can't even admit it was torture. Listen to this.
It implies that you have a definition of what torture is. What is it?
Well, torture to me, Chuck, is an American citizen on his cell phone making a last call to his 4 young daughters shortly before he burns to death in the upper levels of the Trade Center in New York City on 9/11. There's this notion that somehow there's moral equivalence between what the terrorists did and what we do, and that's absolutely not true. We were very careful to stop short of torture. The Senate has seen fit to label their report torture, but we worked hard to stay short of that definition.
Well, what is that definition?
They stayed short of torture. I'm guessing he means they stopped short of torture. Nothing that the U.S. did, according to Dick Cheney, was torture, even though some of the techniques were the same techniques that the U.S. called torture when the Japanese did it to us. What about just saying to Dick Cheney, was waterboarding torture when the Japanese did it to American soldiers? Let's get him on record one way or the other, Lewis.
Well, it comes down to the definition of torture, and that has been redefined. Let's also add that people died during these enhanced interrogation. I mean, if it's just enhanced interrogation, people probably aren't going to die, right?
No, of course. And that entire whitewashed wordsmith term is obviously ridiculous. Another great question for Cheney would be, go through the list of techniques that are listed in the Senate torture report and tell us which would be okay for other countries to do to American soldiers. Because isn't that really what's at issue here? If this is not torture, then it would be okay for other countries to do this to Americans.
I think that would be a great question to put to Dick Cheney. But, you know, I wouldn't even call this interview hardball. I mean, it was pretty softball considering the content.
And then lastly, Dick Cheney insisting, and I actually believe him when he says this. I don't think he's lying. And in fact, I don't think Dick Cheney's lying about anything he said in this interview. I think everything he said, he probably believes to be true. There's one thing, though, that I happen to believe him on in terms of the facts, which is that George W. Bush and he both did know about what was being done and did approve it. And he says that during the interview.
There would be special meetings from time to time on various subjects. that he would be directly involved in. This man knew what we were doing. He authorized it. He approved it. A statement by the Senate Democrats for partisan purposes that the president didn't know what was going on is just a flat out lie.
But back
it's a cheap shot piece of political business that was not bipartisan, nor was it involved any discussion with the people involved in the.
Yeah, I happen to think that he's telling the truth here, Lewis. I find it incredibly unlikely. We know that the CIA was lying about the extent to which these techniques were being used, but the idea that Bush and Cheney just had no clue what was happening does not seem believable to me. So I believe Cheney.
Yeah, I think he is telling the truth. And I think he truly believes what he's saying when he says that it wasn't torture, because they were able to define torture. And although we realize it is torture in the way we interpret it, legally speaking, he thinks it just wasn't torture.